We will be back to our regularly scheduled content next week, but in alignment with the conversation we had last week around the world burning and being visible in this time of just insanity, and when so many sort of big scary things are happening, I wanted to make sure that we had that sort of mindset conversation, but I also wanted to pair it with something that is really tactical. And that's going to lead us to today's conversation. We are actually revisiting an episode I released last year around calls to action because the place where this discomfort manifests, I think, the most obviously and the most detrimentally is in your calls to action, because we soften that pitch, right? We soften that bridging of the gap between the information we're giving them and the next steps they need to take to see real meaningful results, right? We go in and we try to make that a little easier, a little less aggressive, a little more comfortable. And that does a huge disservice for us, but it also does a huge disservice for our listener. And so I wanted to revisit this conversation where I'm going to walk you through auditing your own calls to action, what to look for. If you have questions, be sure to reach out. I'm happy to answer them. And again, next week we will return to regularly scheduled, planned content, but I couldn't have that conversation and not also have this more tactical option and resource for you. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. We're having a little heart-to-heart today. That's right. You and me are going to have some tough talk. I have been having some conversations and talking to podcasters who assure me they are definitely using their podcast as a sales tool. However, when we get into a podcast strategy intensive and I sit down to do the audit, I immediately figure out why their current sales plan or marketing efforts are not getting them where they want as far as results from the podcast. And it's generally because there is either no real call to action, or because there is sort of what I call a throwaway call to action as they wrap up the episode. Sort of and if this is interesting, let me know. Or it sounds like what you hear at the very end of this show, but that's it. That's the only call to action, is that pre-recorded outro, which, as I explained in our outro on the More Profitable Podcast right here, not many people listen to that. So they're not actually seeing results. However, they're going through motions that feel like they should be effective. And so that's why I want to break down calls to action today. That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to dig into how to make your calls to action effective. I'm going to assign homework right up front, because what I want you to do when you are done listening to this episode is go and audit your most recent episode. And I'm going to tell you that now because I want you to, as we're talking through this, be creating your checklist, creating your priorities, because the reality that no one wants to acknowledge is that there is not a magic list of boxes we need to check to make sure we get exactly what we want out of our podcast. There's not a magical set of steps that guarantees success to anything. I think as business owners, we know that really well, and spend a lot of money trying to prove ourselves wrong in buying up the must-have course and the must-have checklist. And the reality is there's not one magical checklist. And that's why, as I go through this conversation today, I promise you're not going to hear, at this timestamp, do this, or structure it like Mad Lib style and say, if you just, fill in these blanks, you too can get results from your podcast. So You've got to be building the audit that works for your show. I will have, as we get into this, some recommendations. I will have some foundational things that are spots that you can take advantage of. But ultimately, you decide what works for you, what works for your audience. Look to bring this to the conversation you're having with the people you trust to help you make decisions for your podcast. If that's a podcast producer, if that's your OBM, if that's somebody in your team, if that is your podcast producer, if that is you and I sitting down for a podcast strategy intensive, whatever it may be, start building out what you want your audit to look like. Do it on a couple of your episodes. Yes, I promise it will not kill you to listen to your own voice. I understand that it's not fun. I hate listening to old episodes of this show. I'll be completely honest with you. It's not my favorite to listen to myself talk, contrary to my chatty reputation. But it is how we get better. It is how we make change. And it's how we get perspective over what we're actually doing. Because I sit down with clients all the time, every month. I'm going to be completely honest, this mostly comes up in podcast strategy intensives. But we sit down and they're like, yeah, I've got tons of we have a call to action in every episode. I am already on the right path to be using this as a sales tool. It's just not clicking yet. So we just need to dial it in. And then I do their audit. And occasionally there's straight up no call to action. No, zilch. But more often than not, there's kind of a throwaway. And if this was helpful, or at the end of their podcast, there's that pre-recorded and it's an ask to get on the email list or join a free Facebook group. Yes, I still hear those. But there's not really a meaningful. Here's the next step. They deliver all this value and they share all this fantastic experience, expertise, and then it just kind of falls off a cliff. Waiting for the next podcast episode that is going to roll through their player. And that's where we turn a sales tool. That's where we turn something that is at the core of our marketing engine into drive time radio. Do you remember drive time radio? Do you remember driving home, listening to... I mean, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, so I'm some old white guy. Yammering on between the occasional musical break and a boatload of commercials. Yeah. I remember the commercials. Couldn't tell you their content. I remember that there was somebody blabbering at me. Rarely absorbed the content. And when I was done with it, it got turned off and it completely left my mind. And I don't want that to be what happens for your listener when they get done listening to your show. I don't want them turning it off and it just disappearing. Because I know that your show is impactful. I know that your expertise is valuable. They do too, that's why they hit play. However, when we format our shows to be all about value, when we format our shows to fire hose at our listener how smart we are, and we don't give them clear and actionable next steps, they turn off the car, go in the house, and the drive time radio, whoop, disappears. Sitting in the car waiting for them to come back, right? But it doesn't impact their day-to-day lives. It doesn't change behavior, doesn't change perspective, it doesn't change results. What does is the next step. And that's why these calls to action are so critical. Reminder, before we dig into some structure stuff, this is a conversation that comes up not infrequently in our podcasting roundtable. So if you would like to join us for the next one, make sure you head over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable and reserve your seat. There is always an opportunity to get your questions asked on that call. And if you know what it is right now, you are not going to have to wait to ask it when we get on the call. Feel free to use the link in the email you got confirming your spot to leave that question for me. If it's pressing, if it's urgent, I often will email you and reach out. Otherwise, we will talk about it in our next roundtable conversation. I tend to prioritize questions submitted before the call and then by people who are on the call live. And then we tend to dig into anybody who's on the call live with questions, and then I'll go to any questions that were submitted, but the person hasn't been able to join us on the call. But what I want you to note there, the takeaway here, is all questions are answered. So head on over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable, reserve your seat, submit your question, and we will talk very soon. This calls to action conversation, one that comes up a ton. So don't feel like you're going to be the only one with questions about this. Bring them. That's what makes us better. All of us, even me, is getting in, asking questions, breaking this stuff down. And not only is that what makes us better, but it's what makes us most ourselves. Because through asking questions and having conversation and hearing other people's questions and hearing other people's answers and perspectives and getting feedback from each other, we start to develop our own filtration system, our own checklist, our own preferences. This is what works. This is what I like. This is what doesn't work. This is what I don't like. This is what feels executable. This is what feels like it's not for me, whatever it might be, okay? So again, uncommonlymore.com/roundtable. I would love to see you there. With that, I'm going to do the thing that I said I wasn't going to do. This is as structure-y, pretend it's a word, and sort of black and white, hard and fast rule as I'm going to get. For me, in my opinion, which, let's be honest, is great. Every podcast episode, every single one, regardless of whether it is a sales asset, social proof, education, values match, mindset focus, whatever the content of the episode is, there needs to be 2 calls to action. 2. There are 2 points of time in which I want you to be giving them being your listener, something actionable. And because we're in this episode, let's just use this episode as an example. We just got through one. I know it didn't fly right by and you didn't notice. We shifted gears. I went from speaking about our content as a whole, getting you on board with what we're going to talk about in the course of this episode, to giving you something outside of this episode to do. And that is, in this case, to join me at the podcasting roundtable. In this show, it is most often either that or the podcast newsroom. Those are again, we're going to be, I'm not even going to pretend that this is not anything other than wildly transparent. Because this is how the sausage is made. We're just going to tell you. Those are my email list options. Those are the ways that I can get line of sight on a listener raising their hand, honestly, saying, I'm on board. I'm in. I can do this. This is what I want. And so that we can move them from interested, we can move them from consuming into conversation. Because that, for me, is where conversion happens. Is when I can talk with you. Because then we can get to, what do you need? What do you want? And once I know that, I can give you the next step to get there. I'll be completely honest. That's not always working with me. However, if I can get you in conversation, I can get you to the result you want, even if that is through a referral to someone else. Because ultimately, that's what's most important to us as experts, right? Is that the people who we're talking to get where they need to go. And by not giving them these calls to action, we're not telling them how to get where they need to go to get the results. And so, yes, I could absolutely stack a paid, right now we've got, our price increase rolling out, and we could absolutely be talking about the fact that now is really your best time to book podcast strategy intensives for 2024 because you're going to be able to secure 2023 rates. I could absolutely be talking about that in that first call to action. Spoiler alert, that's what we're going to talk about in the second call to action. But for me, I want to make my easiest ask first. I want to make the ask that is the least lift for you early in the episode because I don't know how long you've actually been here. As much as I try to make this show feel like it's just you and me, and that I make this show just for you and I, and that you and I sit down together every week and talk just you and I, there's lots of you and I's. And some you got here yesterday. And some you got here 10 years ago now, because we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary a couple of weeks before this episode gets released. We're like right at it. It's exciting. And so I certainly want to make a call to action to a purchase, but doing that in the first 8 minutes of an episode, if you just got here, not going to land real well. But 8 minutes in, I might be able to get you on an email list. I might be able to get you to come join us for a roundtable, and I hope it did. uncommonlymore.com/roundtable. Make sure you have your spot reserved. So where does this first one go? For me, this first one goes after I spent some time really making it abundantly clear what we're talking about today. Because obviously you get a little insight from our hook that sits at the beginning of the episode. Then we've got our pre-recorded intro. And then I want to come in and I want to talk to you. I don't want to go right into selling you something, even if that something is free. Because I haven't bought that attention yet. I haven't bought that time yet. I'm still executing on the promise of what this episode might be from the title, right? We've talked about sort of this, what each element of the show kind of buys you as far as attention and capacity. And so I want to spend some time really getting you on board. And so that is going to go in once I feel like I've done that. There's not a minute mark. There is not it goes in at 4 minutes in. It's when I've made my initial point, which is to sell you on taking in the larger, well, really the smaller point. So it's the big picture. I have to sell you on the big picture so that I can take you through the steps. So I had to sell you on the idea of talking about effective calls to action before we got into this, where I'm talking about timing calls to action or how many there should be. Then we go back into the meat of the episode. We're in and out. I try to be in and out as quickly as I can while making the point I need to make. The question that most frequently comes up here is why I do that instead of running a mid-roll ad. There's no music and pre-recorded ad and then music and then we come back into the episode. I don't run it like a commercial. I ingrain it in the episode. I do that because I like it better. Seriously. And I say this because I want to highlight for you that that's not necessarily the right way. Doing it pre-recorded is not necessarily the wrong way. We have several clients who we do that for who see fantastic results from their podcast and that structure. Especially those who occasionally have like affiliate offers or sponsorships that they're highlighting in that spot. Or who run mid-roll ads that are dynamic, meaning there is a timestamp built into the episode and we run a dynamic ad that pops in at a certain point in the episode. There's not one right way to do this. I do it this way because I'm building trust with you. I want this to feel like I'm leaving you an obscenely long Voxer. I want this to feel like you and I are talking and I've just really run away with it, which is possible, right? And so that is why ours is structured that way, because I want it to be right inside our conversation as a whole. I want it to fit right in. Later in the episode, generally at the end of the episode, right before you hear the pre-recorded outro, which by the way also has calls to action in it, I have a paid call to action. If you've ever listened to any of this show ever before, you know this structure already. And I apologize in advance for the fact that you will not unhear it now when you listen to future episodes. But I go through my subpoints that support my larger point. And then I tie it into whatever we're offering. That, for me, allows me to, again, do it in conversation, do it in context of the episode as a whole. The other reason I like to have it there is this. Generally, whatever that paid call to action is, whether it be a podcast strategy intensive or the profitable podcaster mastermind or podcast production services with our team, you've heard it. You've heard the language. You've heard the name. You've heard the title. You've heard me use all of those words already in the episode. I have planted seeds. So now when we close out the episode and I have my, just as a reminder, or this is a great thing to do in, or this is what we cover, or whatever that bridge is that I use to get us from content to call to action. And I say, join us now, reserve your spot now for a podcast strategy intensive in 2024 and secure our 2023 rates. Yes, you will hear me say this in a couple of minutes. It's not the first time you've ever heard podcast strategy intensive. So your question now is not, oh, what's that? Your question is, oh yeah, that's what she mentioned earlier, and that a part of that was what we were talking about today. You already have context for what the offer is because I've talked about it in the content. And that's one of the biggest reasons that paid offer sits at the end of the episode and not in that spot in the middle, beginning-ish. Because I'm going to use the content to give you context. That way it's easier for you to convert. Because now you understand. You know what's happening. I'm not tricking you. We're not trying to get you to sign up for something before you fully understand what it is. I don't want that. And so I've planted seeds, some language and some context that I'm going to ask you to rely on when I get to that call to action. This is why your 30-second outro talking about how you've got space now for one-on-one clients isn't converting. Because strategically, you're not aligning your content with the call to action. You're just saying, oh, hey, here's now. Instead of really using your content to get them to a point where they're like, yeah, that's what I need. Now, full disclosure, and I know you already know this, but I'm going to say it anyways because I love you. This does not mean that every single person who listens to every single episode buys every single thing every time. There is such a thing that we don't talk enough about called buyer readiness. And so that call to action, any call to action really, is only going to work when that listener is a ready buyer. When they're still working through that readiness, the content simply helps them move in the direction. And this is why I get people in my DMs on the regular telling me that production with our team is on their wish list for that year, the next year, whatever it may be. Because those calls to action are working. It is helping them decide, understand, give context to how we may be helpful to them when they're ready. It's not us building trust and them getting information and then one day out of nowhere, I start going, you could pay me. And they go, what? No, that's not what's happening. They're getting educated into a purchase decision, even if that current decision is not yet. Because not yet is not the same as no. And this is why buyer readiness matters. For some people who listen to today's episode, and you may be one of them, I hope you are. It'd be a blast. When I get into what we're going to get into right now and talk about the ability to book your podcast strategy intensive, there's going to be somebody who goes, yes, let me do this, put the deposit down, and book my date. Absolutely. And for some people who listen to this episode, it's going to be closer to, I would love to do a podcast strategy intensive. I know it's not time yet, but that's how I want to work with Stacy when I decide to work with her. And that is still what I need. That's still good. That's how we sell podcast strategy intensives in Q2 and Q3 and Q4 and over and over and over and over again. Because for every person who's saying, yep, now's the time, there's also somebody going, not yet. It's not a no, it's just a not yet. And so these calls to action, tying together these offers with the work we do, getting a peek inside of what we talk about in those offers, that's how this show is effective, even for those not currently ready. Those calls to action still have to exist, are still important, are still impactful, are still helpful to the listener, even if there are a not yet. And more importantly, from a, conversion business standpoint, if I only focus on value because I decide that every listener to this show is a first-time listener, and I don't want to get too salesy too soon, I will never convert the listeners who are here for weeks or months or years because I'm so afraid to scare off the person who just found the show that I'm not converting my biggest fans, my warmest leads, because I'm not giving them an opportunity to raise their hand. And that's the problem, is when you leave it to that last little 30-second, and we have spots available now for one-on-one work, and that's it. This is why you're frustrated with your show. This is why your show is not delivering the results you want and quite frankly need it to deliver. to be sustainable. And this is the work we do in podcast strategy intensives, maybe most often, is this calls to action work. Yes, we're building your 12-week strategy. Yes, we're coming up with content ideas. Yes, we're doing the audit, but this is often the bulk of the audit. It's not your cover art. It's not, podcast titles. It's not your show description. It's your lack of calls to action. It's the lack of clear next steps for the listener. And that's why I want you to make sure this isn't the case for you by joining me for a podcast strategy intensive. Book a conversation. Let's have a chat. You'll find the link in the show notes, or you can go to uncommonlymore.com/intensive to either book a chat with me or go ahead and book your intensive right now. Either way, I look forward to seeing you on my calendar and right back here next week. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.